Well, I know a lot about Charlemagne now because I did a lot of research on Charlemagne. And I'm very, very pleased to be asked to share that with you. And my husband Joe and I really appreciate you inviting us here. To come up to Tower is always a beautiful drive, and now when the colors are starting to turn already, here it is, and it was just beautiful, thank you. And we bring you greetings from the Hibbing Historical Society, where we are both very active members and are in the process of planning our annual meeting for our membership as well. I have, for quite a few years, really liked your society's annual garage sale fundraiser called Charlemagne's Attic. And it may even have been that wonderful name that first caught my attention and made me think I should learn more about Charlemagne and what's in his attic. And so I began to do some research on him back in early 2021. And you will, of course, remember that at that time, the world was still very much in the difficult days of COVID, and gatherings such as this one just were not happening. And I think as I began to do my search and found out more about the Tower family and the time period in the world and in America, it removed me a little bit from the world that we were living in. And it also reminded me that the world is never perfect, and the country is never perfect, and times are always difficult for some people. And we can all get through this together. So I went back in time to learn about Charlemagne Tower, who, by the way, will eventually be Charlemagne Tower Sr. He was born in 1809 in Paris, New York, the first of 8 children born to Reuben Tower and Deborah Taylor Pierce Tower. And inspired by the classics, his parents named their children. Get this in your mind, here are some good names for you. Charlemagne, Julius, Henrietta, Fayette, DeWitt, James, Francis, and finally Reuben Jr. Now the oldest of those wonderfully named kids was Charlemagne. And I wish that I could find out if he was really called that around the house and out on the playground. Did he have a nickname? Was there a shortened version? Charles? Or did people really always call him Charlemagne every time? Through his mother's family, he was a direct descendant of the first Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who was also known as Charles the Great. Well, whatever he was called, Charlemagne was an excellent student. He was educated at several fine Eastern academies, and at age 14, he began a teaching career, teaching younger children. People grew up fast in those years. After 3 years, when he was 17 years old, he entered Harvard University, and he graduated in 3 years, and then began a law career. The term used to be reading law, because a young man, and you have to remember at this time it was all young men who were in the profession, instead of going to a law school, they would be apprenticed to a law firm. And after working there for a few years, they would take the bar exam. So that's what Charlemagne did, and he was admitted to the bar in 1836 and began his own practice. And then we're going to just skip ahead because I'm going to refer to his children. So I want to skip ahead to 1847 when he gets married to Amelia Malvina Bartle. And they would have 7 children. 1 boy, named after his father, Charlemagne Jr., and the rest were all girls. And we do know that Charlemagne Jr. went by Charlie. Now, Tower Sr. specialized in legal issues regarding land claims. You have to remember the time period. This is in the first half of the 1800s and into the middle of the 1800s. And in America, it was very hit and miss where people had put down roots and where they claimed land. And there was a lot of dispute about that. So he was hired to travel through Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky by a man named Alfred Munson, who owned, or thought he at least owned, a lot of land in those states. And he wanted someone to find out if his titles to that land were all accurate and if the land was even worth him owning. So Munson was what we would call a speculator. And such a man took educated chances buying up swaths of land in the hope that there would be large gold or silver or coal or other minerals in the ground. And he sent Charlemagne Tower Sr. out to investigate this. He and Tower would soon become business partners, and so impressed was the older Munson with Tower that he then sent him off on the most important search of all. This was up into the northeast area of Pennsylvania, into an area that would become known as the coal fields of Pennsylvania. With great energy, whether in court or by buying up the interests of other owners or by evicting squatters, Charlemagne Tower began to make a lot of money in that area. He established a general law practice in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. He hired several other energetic young lawyers, while he himself stayed mostly interested in land ownership. And that's where Tower's money comes from, the money that he would eventually invest right here. His interest in finding ways to gain ownership of property and then either sell it at a profit or develop it. In 1861, just days after Fort Sumter and the start of the American Civil War, Tower, in the patriotic fever of the time, recruited 270 men from his Pennsylvania county to enter the Union Army. His unit became known as the Tower Guards. At his own expense, he provided uniforms and arms for that unit, and he was held in high esteem by the men and the American government. He was given the rank of captain for his dedication. He never was on a battlefield, but he made sure that his unit had all the supplies they would need when they went into battle. But in 1863, with that war dragging on, the American government asked him to do another job, one of recruiting additional men for the military for other units. This was an unpopular job, and only the use of force from a militia group, which Tower had requested from the state government, got this draft to produce the required number of men. Those who were draft resistors were tarred with the brush of treason, and mine owners who believed that those same men were involved with labor activities were glad to see them shipped off to the battlefields. And Tower was friends with those mine owners, and so his own reputation began to get blackened by those forceful tactics that he had used to recruit those men. Following the war, Tower turned his attention back to his interest in land. One of his cases, which actually began before the war, took nearly 25 years to complete. So if we think law is complicated today, imagine working on something for 25 years. That particular case involved an elaborate land grab scheme that he and Alfred Munson had devised. Anthracite is the highest rank of coal. And it was highly sought after because it produces very little smoke. And it has the highest energy density of all coal types. And it is very rare. First, 8,000 acres, then 11,000 acres in northeast Pennsylvania was found to contain anthracite. However, the title issues on that property was a problem because some of that property had ownership issues that went back to before the American Revolution. And this is why establishing ownership, sometimes through just this side of legal means, took years of work by Tower. After finally acquiring the property rights for Munson and himself, Tower began to look for buyers as he and Munson wanted to turn a profit now on this land and not develop it. But because of those earlier clouded issues, potential buyers were not easy to find. Eventually, Tower sold this property to the president of the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad. Now, those of you who played Monopoly, you know I always thought it was the Reading Railroad, but it was the Reading Railroad. And I used to even think it was kind of a made-up name. It wasn't. It's a real entity. It was one of the first railroads in America. And it became the means to transport all that coal. Tower himself made over $1 million from this sale. Now, we can't really even imagine how much money that would be today. It would not be $1 million what $1 million is to us. It would be 100 times, is that what we, at least what we say for $1 million in those years compared to today. But another railroad was going to have an even greater significant place in Tower's life, and that was the Northern Pacific Railway, where he served on the board of directors. Now, in Minnesota, we are deeply connected to that railway because it had its starting point in Carlton, Minnesota, in 1870. The Philadelphia banking house of J. Cook, another name that resonates in this area, he was the one who sold, through his bank, $30 million in bonds to finance that railroad, which had a goal of going from Carlton out to Seattle. And all along the way, property had to be bought throughout the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. And remember Tower's great interest in land, he was really interested in as that land was being purchased. Well, several financial collapses and many a crisis later, the investors, particularly J. Cook, decided that this railroad was not a good deal and it would be left to other people to develop it. But Tower bought up a lot of property along where the railroad was going to go. He got it at rock bottom prices, and soon he had far-flung land holdings way past Minnesota. First Nations people who lived in this area here for centuries knew of iron ore's presence in the Lake Superior region and had shown samples of it to European explorers long before the prospectors of the 1860s ever arrived up here. So to say, as historians often do, that George Stuntz, who was a government land surveyor, discovered ore is really incorrect. But we do remember George Stuntz in the names Stuntz Bay, Lake Vermilion, and Stuntz Township, now a part of Hibbing. And by the way, George Stuntz died penniless in 1902 when he was 81 years old. He made a great deal of money for other people, but he never acquired much for himself. Now, back in 1865, just as the Civil War was ending, a short-lived gold rush was touched off in the Lake Vermilion area. Prospectors who came up here, of course, looking for gold, made note that there were large iron deposits. However, ignore it. Who cares about iron ore? We want gold. That was the attitude. Because the need for iron ore seemed so unimportant at the time, and small deposits in the eastern part of America seemed adequate for the country. However, some white men, such as Lewis Merritt, who went home to Duluth clearly disappointed that he had failed to find gold in northern Minnesota, did tell his young sons, "There's iron up there." And he was enthusiastic about that iron because he seemed to be seeing a future where iron would be important. And those boys would, when they had grown up, become the 7 iron men who would find the hidden ore on the Mesabi Range. But before the Merritts had made their monumental discovery, earlier in 1875, with iron growing rapidly in value, with the industrial age now fully underway, and iron deposits needed to be found to feed the new Bessemer furnaces that could turn iron ore into tough steel. In 1875, we meet in this story some other men whose names still resonate here. George Stone was a Duluth banker and promoter who wanted to see his city and the area around it thrive the way eastern cities were thriving. He had lost a lot of money overextending himself in his investments with Jay Cooke, and he wanted to rebuild his future. He was part of a group from Ontonagon in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan who were great believers that the iron ore body found in the Upper Peninsula extended under Lake Superior and continued in the arrowhead of Minnesota. And they were right. Through his connections with Jay Cooke, who was a Philadelphia banker, Stone traveled to Philadelphia to meet a man who had the means to finance an exploration of the Vermilion area, Charlemagne Tower Sr. And Tower, who had taken other chances on America's land, did agree to fund an expedition. Not that he was going to leave his house and lead it. He was, after all, by this time 66 years old, which was an old man for the time. It's not true anymore, because I'm 66. Tower had heard that Jay Cooke was interested in building a railroad to Lake Vermilion, since he was also working on a railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota to Duluth, and then he wanted to extend it up to Lake Vermilion. And Tower was interested in investing that bundle of money he had made in the Pennsylvania speculation. George Stone hired George Stuntz, who had already been deep into the arrowhead and believed that ore could be found in large amounts. Also hired by Tower to make that journey was Albert Chester, a highly respected professor of mineralogy. And if you're familiar with Chester Creek in Duluth, that's who that's named after. Tower also hired a man who was experienced in the mining of iron ore in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Edward Brighting. And you recognize that name up here. He was an immigrant from Germany, and he had opened mines in Nagani, I always get that name pronounced wrong, in the UP, including the very famous Republic mine. Also along was Tower's son-in-law, Richard Lee, who was an engineer and surveyor. With Ojibwe as their guides, the men started north out of Duluth in canoes on the St. Louis River. Other men connected to the Ontonagon group were already exploring in the Mesabi Hills, but soon they came to think that the ores of the Mesabi were too lean and not to be worth much. We are told that as these groups of men moved from the eastern end of the Mesabi Range towards the Embarrass River, their compasses swung wildly, the needles so confused because there was iron in the ground. They collected samples to bring back for further testing, but the ore, they still believed, was just in small, scattered amounts and very disappointing. Tower wanted weekly reports, so Ojibwe men were hired to carry the messages from the camps here in the Arrowhead to Stone's Duluth office, and from there, the messages were telegraphed out to Pennsylvania. The Ojibwe courier would leave the camp on Monday, arrive in Duluth on Wednesday, and return to the camp on Saturday to begin the whole process again in the next week. And not on horseback. I want to make that clear. These were couriers on foot. Then, at the end of July 1875, imagine the bugs, George Stuntz's group set off a blast near Lake Vermilion, the first blast ever on the Vermilion Range. This was in the hillside where, back in 1866, George Stuntz had first encountered the ore shown to him by the indigenous people. Albert Chester, having decided that the Mesabi ore was unimpressive, had come along to Lake Vermilion and was shown the results of that first blast. And he was highly impressed with what they could all see, a solid cliff of pure hematite ore that the blast had revealed. The group returned to Duluth and sent off full reports to Charlemagne Tower and to the Minnesota State Geologist. And then, nothing happened. 1875, 1876, 1877. Well, an economic depression was happening, and prices of Bessemer steel sank to deep lows. And I think it should remind us that that's the history of this place. We have highs and we have lows, and then we come up again. George Stone wrote letter after letter to Pennsylvania, to Tower, begging him to purchase land around Vermilion before someone else got it. And Tower agreed. The ore looked very promising in quality and quantity. However, he pointed out time and time again in his letters back to Stone that the ore was so far away, it would be so hard to get to it. There was no railroad. The Great Lakes had to be crossed. It just didn't seem feasible. And then, in 1879, as the country's overall economy began to rise, and with it the price of Bessemer ore, Tower finally decided that it was time to act. He asked Chester to lead another exploration up towards Vermilion. Supplies were sent in the winter, sent north in the winter, when the frozen swamps and trails made it easier to skid wagons from Duluth up to the site. Several of the same men headed up the St. Louis River in the summer of 1880, including Albert Chester and George Stuntz. And the news from this further exploration was amazing. The Vermilion ore was tested and found to be 50 to 70% iron. There was hardly any phosphorus in it. The formations were huge. The Bessemer furnaces were waiting for that ore to be made into steel. Once again, Ojibwe runners were hired to carry weekly messages to Duluth that could be relayed to Tower. And there were other Ojibwe men who were hired to work with these explorers. Some of the younger Ojibwe were quite interested in these men and the world that they came from. These Ojibwe, of course, didn't know that their land, their lakes, their forests were on the precipice of being forever changed. Charlemagne Tower was ready to invest in the future. Existing American government laws required that land be surveyed and then opened to settlers in parcels of 160 acres. People who signed on for the land paid very little money for it because the government wanted to see the land civilized. Those settlers, though, needed to adhere to certain rules. They needed to be working at making improvements on the land, such as building a house, a barn, clearing land for farming. However, it was also possible that a failed homesteader could sell their land. But if word got out about the mineral potential in this Vermilion land, the fact that it was isolated and swampy and buggy would not matter. People would want it, and the price would go way up. Duluth's George Stone knew how to obtain the titles to this land, the same way lumber companies had obtained land for years. This method made use of phony owners, handpicked, in this case by Tower, from the men who worked for him. A man would purchase the parcel of land using Tower's money, and then soon that phony settler would fail as a homesteader and sell the property to Tower and make a nice little profit for himself. No one in the government seemed to really care that the land hadn't been improved with a house or a barn or a road. The settler might even do some brush clearing, take down a few trees in order to be able to claim that he had improved the land. But in truth, no one in the government offices really seemed to care who ended up with the titles to this. The land of northern Minnesota was so remote, it was so swampy, and the soil was rocky. Who wanted this land? This was not the beautiful farmlands of other places in the American Midwest. That was the land that people wanted and the government cared about. No one except a handful of men seemed to know that many of these Vermilion parcels would turn out to be worth millions. Tower began to accumulate parcels on the Vermilion Iron Range, especially the area that George Stuntz had deemed the most promising, and that is the area that would eventually become known as Sudan. But getting the first equipment for the mine up here, what needed to be built first was a sawmill with all its equipment, and then steam boilers and wagons. Well, all of that had to be dragged in the dead of winter over frozen ground by oxen. Could you do it? I couldn't. This was tough going. One earlier prospector had also noted, this is no poor man's mining country. This will take a lot more than a shovel and a bucket to mine. It has been estimated that just preparing to mine here, Tower had spent over $3 million. And again, remember what money was worth at that time. And he would eventually spend at least another $1 million and mortgage all of his property. This was not a cheap and easy place to mine. And Tower also acquired parcels of land along the North Shore because he was going to need a harbor. from the area that would be known as Agate Bay, and that was eventually renamed Two Harbors, up to Lake Vermilion. He bought land and purchased an inactive railway project that had never gotten off the ground. And it would eventually become known as the Duluth and Iron Range Railway, or the D&IR. It was George Stuntz's suggestion that the smartest route between Agate Bay and Lake Vermilion was the route that the indigenous peoples had used for thousands of years. It would still be very difficult. It would still be a very difficult railway line to build. This was not the sort of land for putting in a railroad. The land sloped, it was swampy, there were lakes to go around, but Tower's engineers agreed that this was the best route for that 68 miles of track. On December 1st, 1882, the Minnesota Iron Company was incorporated. Charlemagne Tower was the president, Edward Brighting was the vice president, and Charlemagne Tower Jr. was treasurer. Now, like his father, Charlemagne Jr., Charlie, was well educated. He was also, in the way of young men of wealth at this time in the Victorian age, very well traveled. He had lived in the great cities of Europe. He studied history, literature, languages, and like his father, he collected books, modern ones, but also collector's items. He eventually amassed over 2,000 books, either in Russian or about Russia. And he would later donate that whole collection to the University of Pennsylvania for a special library. It was on a cruise to Alaska that he met and fell head over heels in love with a young woman by the name of Helen. She went by Nellie Smith. They married and moved into a fine home in Philadelphia, and he studied and read history and wrote histories and became a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. So this intelligent, soft-spoken man, apparently liked by everyone he met, including Mark Twain, was asked by his dad to head to Duluth to oversee the building of a railroad. And Charlie did what his dad asked and went to Duluth. Once he got there, Charlie dug right in. He wrote letters, sometimes twice a day, to his father, detailing all the work being done. And Tower Sr. wrote glowing letters to friends, telling how successful his son was and how successful the railroad building was going. And this was important for people to know, because if people were going to invest, they had to know that the train would run on time. So, Tower Sr. was looking for other people to invest, and he found two such men, the Ely brothers, who Ely is named for, Samuel and George, who made their money on the Marquette Range in the Upper Peninsula. They were enthusiastic about this new place to find iron ore, and they pushed that the ore get mined and shipped as soon as possible because they wanted other people to invest. And people weren't going to invest unless they saw something happening. By September 1883, the land for the town to be named Tower had been cleared. And by the way, there's also a Tower City in North Dakota that is also named for Charlemagne, because that's some of the property he owned out there. Everyone on the Vermilion Range seemed to know that the town's name was in honor of a man who would never put foot in the place, but whose money and willingness to take a risk was responsible more than anything else for the mining operations underway. The building of the railroad was on time, and so now Tower Jr. was overseeing yet another project, the docks at Agate Bay, where the ore would be transferred to the ships to be carried across the Great Lakes to those eastern steel mills. The first mining crews and their families 350 men, women, and children were recruited from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, from mines near Vulcan and Iron Mountain and Norway, Michigan. Charlemagne Jr. clearly was excited about the possibilities of this new frontier where he found himself. And at last, the great day was coming. It was time to start moving ore down to the lake. July 31st, 1884. A sunny day, and the crowd gathered dressed in their Sunday best clothes. The Ojibwe who lived in the area had been especially invited by Charlie, and he presented them with gifts of pork and flour and asked if he could come and visit them in the future. He was fascinated by their culture. And then, as the crowds watched, the railroad builders put in that final few yards of track, and the train arrived, and the mine blew its whistle in welcome. And just a couple of hours later, that same train, with its 220 tons of ore, which had been immediately loaded into the train cars from a growing stockpile, retraced its journey down to Lake Superior, where, shortly before midnight, as that first train arrived in two harbors and that first load of ore thundered down the chutes from that new ore dock into the waiting ship, Charlie knew that his father was waiting back in Philadelphia, anxious to hear. And so he sent a telegraph to his dad. It read, "All well contented with our day." It was the first commercial shipment of Minnesota's vast iron ore deposits. Minnesota's iron ore, the contribution to America and the world, was now underway. Charlemagne Tower Sr. was 75 when that first ore was shipped. He had sent his namesake into the lands where he himself would never travel. He had placed his trust in the word of others that in these rugged lands of northern Minnesota, 70 miles inland from Lake Superior, there was iron ore that the country and the world needed. He risked bankruptcy when more cautious men did not share his confidence. In 1887, Charlie left Duluth and returned to Philadelphia to teach. And not long after that, a powerful Chicago financial syndicate, which included such men as John D. Rockefeller, Cyrus McCormick, and Marshall Fields, successfully pressured the Towers into selling their Minnesota ore operations. Supposedly, the deal closed when the Towers received $6.4 million. The Towers never gained the fullest returns for their iron that they had found and developed here on the Vermilion Iron Range. On July 25th, 1889, Charlemagne Tower Sr. shuffled off this mortal coil. His obituary noted that he died due to a paralysis. Surely, that was one of the few times in his 80 years that he was quiet. Charlemagne Jr. would be named by American President McKinley to serve as ambassador to the powerful Austria-Hungarian court in 1897. Charlie and his wife and their 5 children would live in Vienna until 2 years later when he was appointed ambassador to the Russian court, where he successfully completed several tricky negotiations with the Tsar. And then he was appointed to the German court, where he and Nellie became great favorites of Kaiser Wilhelm II. In 1908, they returned to America. Truly examples of wealthy lives in the Gilded Age. Charlie would die of pneumonia in 1923, having watched with horror as the First World War decimated so much of the Europe he had known and loved. So the next time you visit or take friends to visit the Sudan underground mine, think about the miners who did the heavy lifting, the dirty work, the dangerous steps all along the way. And also think of the Charlemagne Towers, senior and junior, and the roles they played on the Vermilion Iron Range. They helped build America, like a railroad heading towards the future. Thank you.